New reports show the RCMP has struggled for years to increase the number of officers who protect politicians. After the assassination attempt on former U.S. President Donald Trump, there is increased concern and discussion about politics and protecting politicians, including here in Canada. So joining us from Kingston with his perspective is Christian Leuprecht, a security expert and professor at Royal Military College and at Queen's University. Welcome back to the show.
Good morning, Anne-Marie.
I want to start by saying we did reach out to the RCMP, who told us the protective policing program is in regular contact with domestic and international partners about protective matters and takes all threats against public officials seriously. So that was their response. Christian, what is the state of security for our politicians here in Canada?
Well, ultimately, politicians decide what the state of security is in terms of both the quality and the quantity of the security that they receive, especially at the federal level, because politicians own not one but two law enforcement agencies that can provide that protection. On the one hand, as you point out, the RCMP, which among other things runs the protective policing program, and on the other hand, the Parliamentary Protective Service. Anybody who's visited Parliament in the last 10 years, the changes made after 2014 when Zehaf Bebo shut off Parliament, established a new, effectively law enforcement agency for the Hill and for members of Parliament. So ultimately, it is up to them to decide what level of protection they believe they need, and it's up to them to pay for it.
There are some stark differences between us and the U.S. when it comes to protecting politicians. We know the Secret Service in the States protects current and former presidents and their spouses for their entire lifetime. What's the comparison here in Canada?
Yeah, so inherently this is based on threat assessments. And if you're a U.S. president and certain U.S. members of Congress, you're inherently at a higher risk, both domestically as well as internationally. But there's also a cultural difference. In the U.S., there's a bit of a status associated of having big, large limousines and people with trench coats running alongside you, so you look really important. Whereas in Canada, politicians tend to be wary of having too much protection, especially around them. Prime Minister Jean Chrétien was famous for not having much RCMP around him, because in Canada and most democracies, politicians don't want to be seen to have to be protected from the very people who elect them. And so there's this fine balance, and we saw this debate after 2014 on Parliament Hill about what sort of active and passive measures were adopted and which were ultimately rejected by politicians that ultimately serve the public interest.
How do we compare to other countries, not just the U.S.?
Well, you start off with the RCMP. The RCMP has the largest span of control of any police force in the democratic world, and there are many of us, including myself, who've argued that that span of control is perhaps too large, that certain functions could perhaps be taken out of the RCMP and either put in dedicated forces or other forces. It is not clear to me that taking the protective policing program out of the RCMP would generate different tactical and operational effects than we are currently able to generate. But certainly we live in an environment where the RCMP is stretched in terms of human and fiscal resources, and where politicians, not just in the United States, but as we know in Canada, the recent attempt on the life of a European prime minister, attacks on campaign workers in France and the United Kingdom, and the list goes on. We live in a much heightened threat environment if you are a politician, in particular a visible federal politician, a member of cabinet, or the prime minister.
Yeah, and actually, you know, Catherine McKenna, a former minister, has spoken out about this issue, among other politicians, you know, at all three levels. But federally, she said, when I was getting threats, as were my cabinet colleagues, it was clear that the RCMP did not have sufficient capacity, nor do I think they were taking the threats seriously. So what more can be done to protect our elected officials in Canada if we know that the threat is on the rise?
So that's an interesting perspective from a former minister of the Crown, because ultimately this is the federal government's police force, and the federal government has the opportunity to reform that force, to staff that force differently, to posture that force differently, and repeated governments have avoided doing so precisely because it would be highly controversial. So I take issue with ministers of the Crown saying that they can't get the level of service that they're looking for from the RCMP when it is ultimately they, as the political authority, that provide the mandate, the direction, and ultimately the financing of resources, human to that organization.
Security expert Christian Leuprecht, great to hear from you this morning. Thanks for having the discussion.
Always a pleasure. Have a good morning.
You too.
Hey, thanks for watching. If you liked this, be sure to subscribe here, or you can check out more Your Morning videos right here.